DDT, also known as dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane, is a synthetic compound in pesticide called an organochlorine. It is also a persistent organic pollutant, or POP. DDT was one of the easiest forms of malaria control, but is quite possibly dangerous for both the environment and humans. DDT was discovered in 1939 and was implemented throughout World War II to prevent 30 different diseases, including malaria. The U.S. heralded DDT as one of its greatest inventions, even creating World War II propaganda about it. DDT was then used widespread throughout the United States for both malaria purposes and farming, until the publication of Silent Spring in 1960s by Rachel Carson, where she brought attention to the problems potentially created by DDT. The United States then banned DDT in 1972, but other countries throughout the world continued to use it, until in 2001, when the Stockholm Convention of the United Nations decided to ban DDT along with 12 other pesticides, except for specific uses for malaria control. Today, 18 countries in both South America, Asia, and Africa use DDT. DDT can only be implemented through indoor residual spraying, or IRS. Indoor residual spraying is done by professionals and includes spraying the eaves, inside corners, and walls of homes. When this is used correctly, it can reduce cases by 90%. India used DDT in this form to cut their cases of malaria, and South Africa recently reintroduced this method to attempt to control malaria as well. Today, 10 countries in sub-Saharan Africa use DDT in their indoor residual spraying. But DDT, as much as it's effective, may not be worth the potential dangers that it poses. One of these that was highlighted in Silent Spring by Rachel Carson is the environmental concerns of DDT. DDT is a lipophilic chemical, and that means that it's going to get stored in the fattiest parts of animals, which means the blubber or the endocrine glands of birds. And then DDT will become subject to biomagnification. As you can see in the pyramid, the animals most at risk for biomagnification are those at the top of the food chain, such as birds of prey. DDT also causes random nerve impulses, which can cause seizures in affected animals. One of the most famous instances would be the effects on birds of prey. So, for example, in Connecticut and Maryland, ospreys saw a severe decline in their population because DDT it thins the eggshells of birds, so when it's laid or cared for, they can be crushed, and so then they produce less offspring every year until their populations were almost, they got put on the endangered list. So the peregrine falcon as well got put on the endangered list due to this. And these birds' populations were affected 20 years after the use of DDT was stopped as well. Another example of problems DDT can cause on the environment and animals is a direct result of indoor residual spraying, which caused the death of house cats all over the world in homes that were sprayed. And when house cats died, there's an increase in rat populations, which led to an increase in disease in those homes as well. And finally, another example, and this one close to home, would be in 1980, there was a DDT spill in Lake Apopka, and the alligator population declined because a metabolite of DDT, DDE, affects androgen production, which then affects reproduction. Now, DDT didn't just have an effect in the past, DDT still has an effect today. And in Canada, 50 years after the last spraying, there is a lake that still has 450 times the limit of DDT that's legal. This is causing both animals to die as well as toxic algal blooms. Now, on top of environmental concerns, there are potential and human concerns with DDT as well. And although nothing can be proven with DDT yet, because nothing can be proven in science and there's always flaws in studies, DDT has been shown in certain studies to cause pregnancy loss, fertility problems, both pancreatic and breast cancer, diabetes, and more. DDT also has an epigenetic effect, meaning that exposure to DDT can pass the disease risk to both that woman's child or grandchild. And DDT effects on human health have only been studied in the US and Europe, And countries with indoor residual spraying, there's a lack of studies on them, so we don't know how that direct contact with DDT in their homes is versus how the exposure in the United States was, where it was more with the farming and drinking water. So the Environmental Protection Agency calls DDT a probable carcinogen. And so Barbara Cohn is one of the most famous researchers for like DDT, and it's breast cancer risks. So she does studies on a group of California women from the 50s and 60s, and one of those studies, she saw that those women who were under 14, when there was a peak of usage of DDT, they had a 5-fold increase in breast cancer risk, whereas those who were over 27, when there was a peak in DDT usage, saw no increase in risk. And then that showed that age when exposed was impacted what happened with the breast cancer risk. So another study on the same group of women, but instead their daughters, showed that those who were born to moms with elevated maternal levels of DDT, they saw a 4-fold increase in risk of breast cancer, because DDT activates HER2, a protein expressed in breast cancer cells, and the daughters of the women in this research group actually 22 of them ended up with advanced stage tumors, and 16 of them ended up with HER2 tumors, positive tumors. And so Barbara Cohn makes 3 points about her research still being relevant today. She says many of the women who were exposed, who were alive during DDT's peak usage, are still alive today. DDT is still being used in many countries around the world. And on top of that, DDT stays in the environment. It actually stays in aquatic environments for its half-life is 150 years. There's also another research study that showed that DDT can increase risk for pancreatic cancer. And in DDT manufacturing workers, they saw a 7.4-fold increased risk of pancreatic cancer. On top of increased cancer risk, DDT can also cause fertility and developmental issues. For example, the same group of California women were studied, and DDT exposure led to a longer time in pregnancy in the daughters versus DDE exposure showed a shorter time to pregnancy in the daughters. And because of this reverse effect, there wasn't any widespread reporting of like fertility issues after the high usage of DDT. So as you can see, the DDE is the white and the DDT is the darker color, and they kind of balance each other out. And then on top of fertility issues, we see that DDT can also impact developmental issues when exposed either in uterine or in early childhood. So over 200 children born where DDT was used in Mexico, those with higher DDE levels saw a decrease in psychomotor development, but only if the exposure was in the first trimester. Again, we see how timing of exposure can impact what happens. And this exposure impacted the development for the full first year of life. Another study on 4-year-olds in Spain saw that both in uterine and early childhood exposure negatively impacted development as well. On top of developmental and fertility issues, DDT has also been shown to cause type 2 diabetes. In a study in Saudi Arabia, those with higher levels of DDE saw increased levels of type 2 diabetes. And as I said before, all studies concerning DDT have their flaws, as with anything, and a lot of people like to say, none of the concerns about DDT have been proven, we should keep using it, it saves more lives than it harms. But it's not just about what is being shown today with its effects. All the studies have been done on the United States and Europe. Nothing has been done on the populations where DDT is being used today, and it could help now, but who knows whether future generations could be at higher risk for cancer and other things that we don't know about right now. So, why is DDT still used today? Because it was effective, it's easy, it's cheap, but just like most other chemicals, the mosquitoes are developing resistance to DDT. So, there are alternative chemicals such as carbamate, but trying different methods rather than spraying pesticides is necessary. Insecticide-treated bed nets, or ITNs, are more applicable, actually. They are more effective when there's a longer malaria season. There are no walls to spray, such as, like they're more makeshift buildings rather than like cement or anything, or mosquitoes tend to land outdoors. But what I have seen through my research is that DDT isn't effective over the long run. More effective methods include a combination of things. So you can't just pick one thing and use it and expect for malaria to be gone. You've got to combine things. You have to give the community resources to allow themselves to help prevent it and not rely on other things. So, for example, there's a study done in Zanzibar where they use artemisinin-based therapy, which is a malaria drug, and long-lasting insecticide nets, which only need to be replaced every 10 years. And they saw a decline in under 5 mortality and malaria prevalence. So you can see from 1999 to 2005 where they implemented the things, they implemented them like in the 2003-2004 timing, they went from 161 deaths in this community to 64 from malaria. On top of this, this is what we call integrated malaria management. So when you combine different methods, including what we'll talk about later is environmental management, the community can maintain it themselves with a little help from outside sources. For example, this region of Kenya, 97% of the people in this community went to a health center for diagnosis and treatment. 81% bought anti-malaria meds, and 90% owned and used an insecticide net. But on top of relying on others for resources, the community also used their own environmental management, repellents, and screens on their doors and windows. This shows that both an increase in availability of resources and a high knowledge in the community can lead to lower rates, as shown in the decline from 2000 to 2007. Now, one of these methods that can be maintained by a community themselves is environmental management. Environmental management means the clearing of slow-moving or stagnant bodies of water where mosquitoes can breed. Environmental management in Nepal reduced cases by 35%. And in this survey of Tanzania, they wanted to assess the knowledge of the community on malaria and mosquitoes so that they could understand why they weren't implementing these kind of techniques. And although 97% knew mosquitoes were the transmitters, only 87% knew that more rain or bodies of water increased malaria transmission. And so the researchers determined that an educational program would be beneficial to this community so that they could maintain their own malaria control. And they also came to the conclusion that this would help many other communities as well. Now, the final method for controlling malaria, and the newest one, would be vaccines. So the only vaccine that's been approved is the RTSS vaccine, which is only 40% effective over 4 years. And in those 5 to 17 months, it prevented 4 in 10 cases and 3 in 10 severe cases, but it also decreased hospital admissions and blood transfusions. You can combine vaccines with other methods, such as nets or environmental management, to protect both the vulnerable populations and everyone else, because under 5 populations are really what gets most affected by malaria. Another vaccine, which was shown to be 100% effective in lab studies, goes into clinical trials in Equatorial Guinea soon. So although vaccines quite possibly could be the future of safe malaria prevention, they need to be combined with other things right now, and then in the future continue to be combined with other things to continue to be effective. So, in conclusion, DDT was once the best option, but it's not anymore because we have growing technology. In the past, we threw chemicals at it, we said, there you go, solve the problem. But now, there are increasing health risks have been proven, as well as environmental risks that we already know about. And of course, change from this kind of thing can't come quick, because some countries rely on aid and support in their malaria prevention. But DDT can be phased out and replaced with multiple methods, whether it be nets, environmental management, and then eventually when they become available, vaccines. And so in this scenario, the right choice is not always the easiest one, especially when people's lives are involved.
Okay, we're going to open it to questions for you, Alexa. I'd like to begin by asking you, who produces DDT today?
So right now it is the United States, Korea, and India, I believe.
So although we ban it in our own country, we make it.
Yeah, so we banned it in our own country, but you know, as with, I feel like the United States does it a lot, like we kind of don't care what happens outside of our country, so we still make money off of making it and deem it to be okay and used on developing populations.
Sort of like cigarettes, that type of thing.
Sort of.
Right.
Pesticide treadmill.
Do you know what company it is? What company it is? No.
Oh,
I
do.
don't.
Dow?
Okay.
No, I believe it's Bayer.
Yeah.
I believe it's Bayer. Or it was, unless they sold off that division.
Singer that makes the paint?
Yes. No, Bayer, B-A-Y-E-R.
Oh,
Yes.
yes.
Oh, like,
Yes.
yeah.
So anything for a buck? I can't believe
Yeah,
that.
this is not the only one. This
Sure.
is most pesticides.
I mean.
Most pesticides that are banned in the United States are produced in the United States and sold to other countries where they are put on our food that we then purchase and bring back to the United
Oh,
States.
gosh.
I,
This is not a good Monday morning.
I have a few, are you, is that,
Question is,
okay.
how does this, sorry,
No, go ahead, go right ahead.
how does it work? You told us about like, yeah, like how does it work on our body?
On our bodies or on
Yeah.
the insects?
Well, okay, insects.
Okay, well, like, so the insects land on it if they, indoor residual spray on the surfaces, and the insects will land on it. And like I said, with the animals, it causes like nerve impulses. So it does that in the insects as well. And then I think that combined with other things that I didn't research can
You
kills
go to
them.
the structure. You want to go to the structure slide?
Oh yeah, sure.
While you're going back to that, I just wanna, language is important in science.
Right.
I love that you pointed out that we don't prove things in science.
Right.
We tend to disprove things. But those are not, so that's an important concept. We also, studies don't have flaws, they have limits.
Right.
And that's different because those limits are usually designed into the experiment. A flaw would suggest you made a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not quite the situation.
Right.
So I'm just like, housekeeping wise, that matters a little bit.
So, what's the one thing that you see on the structure a lot?
Chlorine.
Okay, so now you said nerves firing in the insects.
Mm-hmm.
So, how does that chlorine affect, say, your nervous system?
I mean,
What is the signal transfer? What element is that? What are those channels?
isn't it potassium and
Okay, potassium channels, sodium channels.
sodium? Yeah.
Okay, those are positive ions.
Mm-hmm. Chlorine's negative, so.
So it's going to take those
Yeah.
ions away from it and cause unnatural flaring of those neurons. Go to the next one.
We can dig, before you go there.
Yeah.
Dr. LP is bringing up a great thing, right? Because in order for it to be a neurological agent, it's disrupting the action potential.
Right.
And you learn that there is a difference in
Mhm.
charge across the membrane. And so by adding all of those chlorides, you're changing that differential across the membrane, which is the reason why you're gonna have these neurological effects.
Okay, there is the next one, the eggs. Yeah. So what is happening to those eggs there?
They're thinned.
Why are they thin? Okay. What are eggshells made up of?
Don't know.
Chalk, calcium, carbonate, right? So why would the eggshells be thin if there is no
Oh,
calcium?
because chlorine's negative and calcium's positive.
Okay, one last question. You said the compound was lipophilic. Why would it be lipophilic?
Because water's got a slight. Water has a slight, it's polar, right? So the chlorine's negative, so it's not gonna like the positive end of water, so it's gonna prefer like fat.
Because of the big funnel group, the hydrocarbon group,
Mm-hmm.
it's non-polar. The chlorine, sure, it's slightly polar, but overall it's non-polar, so it will go to fatty acids.
Mhm.
How do we control mosquitoes locally here in Vero Beach? Is that yellow plane I see flying around related to it?
It can't be DDT, but there's stuff that's like, DDT is part of like that persistent organic pollutant family, but there's a lot of other pesticides that like stand outside of those 12 different banned chemicals that they can continue to use. Like the one I mentioned, like carbamate, it's not banned, but it's a lot more expensive, so they wouldn't want to use that in developing countries when other countries have to pay for it, but I'm sure they would be fine using it here. But something probably pretty similar.
So we probably use something more expensive, but less demonstrably dangerous.
Right.
Well,
Well.
Or maybe not.
what about, I mean, one of the things that we use here, actually, even more than the yellow plane, is we use mosquito compounding, right? Where we create these artificial compounds, we flood them with water, then we pull the water down to create money banks, which is super attractive to mosquitoes.
Right.
They land, they lay their eggs, and then we pull the floodgates, and we literally drown all the larvae.
Really?
Yeah, that's what all those, yeah, that's how this island is livable.
I
Like,
mean-
that's what all those, that's the whole point of all of those locks that we have along the thing. So why aren't we using that in developing countries?
I mean, one thing would be like organizing it. So like in places where it's a lot less like accessible, you can kind of teach them strategies like like to control, because like especially like places where they like grow rice paddies, that's a big thing. Like if it's not in season, they're like told like maybe you need to like drain these, or maybe you need, but like typically they don't, because it's more work, and like they may not know that that's what causes more mosquito breeding.
And what was the region that you mentioned that has a lot of malaria? What part of Africa is using a lot of DDT?
Well, okay, here's the map. So it's gonna be like the more southern part like of Africa, like all sub-Saharan. There's nothing really in North Africa, but
So what key resource is necessary for mosquito compounding that's missing in sub-Saharan Africa?
flooding.
Yeah. It comes when it comes.
Yeah.
There's not like a lot of, so that physical thing is a problem.
Right.
Can you tell us what unintended consequences are in environmental science?
I mean, that's gonna be things that you can't think of ahead of time, right? So unintended, I mean, the DDT had an unintended consequences in the United States, but like, you know, once we knew about the birds cause other things, because, you know, once you impact one part of the food chain, you impact the rest.
And so how does the precautionary principle of environmental science, how does that relate to the unintended consequence theory of environmental science, and sort of what's happening here?
So how does the,
Like, so how does the precautionary
Mhm.
principle apply to unintended consequences in this situation?
so, I mean, the more precautions you make, the less potential unintended consequences, right? So, I mean, if you stop using DDT, you don't have to think about what it could potentially be causing and try and prevent those. Rather, you just cut out the problem from the roots.
Yeah, the whole idea there, right, is that if you don't know all of the potential negatives,
Right.
then you don't move forward until you've identified them.
Well, the question becomes, in real time, how many agents are we using today that we think are just fine, and 10 years from now, we're gonna find out, oh, that's not so great after all. I'm a DES baby, and, for women in the 1950s, diethylstilbestrol was the treatment of choice if you were having issues with pregnancy. And I am the product of a mother who had 4 sets of twins through that process, and now I have to declare to my doctor that I'm a DES baby because there's long-term consequences, more for women, but also with some treatment for men. Any other questions for Alexa?
I said one, and maybe I missed it, you explained it, but we talked a lot about the age of the
Right.
human,
Right.
who's, and how they're impacted, and the younger they are, the more impact from this exposure. Did you, I know you said, you might have told me, but I missed it. Why are the younger children more adversely affected by DDT?
I know at least for like in uterine, since it's the first trimester, they're not going to be like fully formed, and the mom's going to know like the maternal serum means that like the maternal levels mean that like, because they found DDT like residues in like breast milk, and like they find it in the placenta and stuff, so the mom is like giving it to the baby throughout that development, right? And I think that's part of why, like how the earlier it is.
Sort of dig a little deeper there for her though. So DDT is serving as what? How is it acting that it's influencing and having adverse impacts on development?
So DDT can cause epigenetic effects, which means like, so you have like your DNA and it's wrapped up in like, I forget the name for it.
Whatever.
But
super-
it's
it doesn't
it's
matter.
wrapped up in stuff. But like what chemicals can do is they come in and they can like, you can shut off or turn on different like genes. So like epigenetic effect, they talk about it like with, okay, so like if you have like a really skinny mom, then when the baby's born, it's going to be really big because it's going to think it's being born into a society where it needs more fat to survive, whereas the mom might just have been thin. So like what's happening in the mom can affect, so then when the mom's pregnant, so the baby inside, if it's a girl, already has its ovaries forming, so that's how the grandchild can get affected as well, because then the mom can change both the DNA of the child as well as change the DNA that's already in the ovaries of that child that she's pregnant with. And they kind of just found out like the epigenetic stuff, like that's new because they thought that wasn't really possible. Like they thought it was just nature versus nurture kind of stuff, but like it's actually in the DNA.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexa.